Well, scholars have noticed for a long time, mainly since the late 19th century, when cuneiform languages were deciphered, they've noticed a lot of similarities between flood stories from Mesopotamia and the biblical flood story. There are a number of trajectories that scholars follow to think about this. One of them would be common memory. Since the Bible is an ancient Eastern Mediterranean or ancient Near Eastern document, it stands to reason that it would have similar stories to other cultures in those regions about some event that happened in great antiquity. In other words, there's a collective memory sense here that it would make sense if something happened and people in those places, in that region, knew about it. They would all write about it. They would all have a version of those things. So one of the options for this is collective memory. Other options include, especially when you get into the chronology of who wrote what when and in relation to what Mesopotamian material the Bible was written, there was considerable debate in the late 19th century about whether the biblical writers borrowed or copied information from more ancient Mesopotamian sources. Practically all scholars in the field today don't use language like that, as though the biblical writer was sitting there at the table and sort of had writer's block and reached over and grabbed a cuneiform tablet that happened to be Atrahasis and said, "Oh great, I needed that, I'm over the hump now. I'm going to put this into my text." Scholars just don't look at it that way anymore. Whereas in the late 19th century, more of them were thinking along those things because that was the first time they'd been exposed to finding very similar flood stories in other literatures. Nowadays, most scholars would look at the material and they would have a keen eye on the differences. A lot of ancient astronaut people just completely skip over the differences, and the differences are important because it informs us that the biblical writer isn't just wholesale copying material. Rather, they're responding to the version of events that occurs in other literature, specifically to state their theological case about the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, getting credit for either the punishment of the flood or the resolution of the flood. They're responding to material, and they're tracking with it closely enough so that people living at the time would know what they're doing, that they're sort of setting the record straight, or they're producing and asserting their own theological claims about these sorts of events.